Since you're filling in today, why don't you start?
Well, first of all, what's your reaction to the report on the $10,000 overtime?
I only heard about it starting today. It doesn't surprise me. But these are things where we continually, as an organization, just have to continue to be as efficient as possible. And sometimes we like to go on and on and on about things and request lots of reports and so on. And sometimes we just got to make a decision.
Do we have to
Besides talking less, is there a solution you can think of?
Other than talking less? We have applied a lot of really modern principles to making a lot of our work more efficient when we're building things, lean manufacturing and so on. And there's a lot of good thinking around how to make decision-making more efficient. And you can use a lot of the same principles to make the decision-making more efficient. And it's always good for us to understand the cost of what we're doing, whether it's asking for another report or going for a long time in meetings and so on.
Naming a new community after one of the pioneers in Calgary.
I love that this community, that this developer is thinking about naming this community instead of Coral Springs, where I live, which has very little to do with Calgary, after the history of this community. I have a couple of questions, though, so I'll give you a preview for later. There's one very technical question about having a community that's bisected by Centre Street and whether you should have the boundaries different. And the other question I have is very specifically about them using the name Weedick for their street names. And the reason for that is because if they use all the pioneer names for street names in this community, it means that we can't name other communities after other pioneers. And I can imagine that someday there may be a community called, Weedickville, like the one at the Stampede. And I want to make sure that we're not stopping ourselves from the opportunity to do that later.
So it's just going to create confusion in the future if we do that?
Yeah, that's exactly my concern. But those are easy things to solve. People can usually sort that out.
What about the Integrity Commission? What's your thinking? You think that's a good idea?
I think it is a good idea. I worked hard over the course of the last few years to bring in a code of conduct for council, to bring in disclosure rules and so on. And this is kind of the last step to that, which is how do we then manage the process when people have complaints against members of council? To be perfectly frank, I wasn't that focused on this when we dealt with the code of conduct and so on, because I thought once the code of conduct is in place, there actually won't be very many complaints about it because people will abide by it. And I think people do generally abide by it. But what we have determined is that the process around investigating those complaints just isn't very good. The city auditor isn't really set up to investigate complaints against members of council. The only way to deal with those complaints is for it to come to a meeting of council, which is awkward and difficult for members of council to make a final judgment on. And if we get the Integrity Commissioner process right, as we have seen in lots of municipalities in other parts of Canada and in provincial order of government, I think it makes a lot of sense.
Your thoughts on the practice that apparently has been happening and may happen again, that councillors using that tool to complain with their councillors?
It has not happened as far as I know.
Liquor stores.
Yep.
Just your personal thoughts about, is there a saturation point for communities?
I actually know a fair bit about the broken window stuff and the tipping point stuff that the community is talking about. I have a lot of sympathy to that. On the other hand, we also can see that the current rules would not stop what we're seeing is happening. It's like when we had the discussion about 17th Avenue Southwest, and we were talking about the proliferation of bars and nightclubs there, and we realized that according to the current rules, we were nowhere near the limit set out by the current rules. So that means that you actually have to think about the rule. And in this particular case, we're looking at a liquor store directly across the street from a public park. And we do have rules around separation between liquor stores and schools. It may well be worth it to have a conversation around separation between liquor stores and parks.
Is it different because on that particular street there already is some overlap that takes over the 300-meter rule?
It may well be. Now, it's a good question because this particular liquor store is not within the separation distance between an existing store, but there are lots of stores that are within that distance. So you have to look at the street, I think, in a holistic manner. The applicant, I think, is very sincere in what he's trying to do. The council also needs to look at the whole thing. So we'll see how council votes on it. I'm going to do something odd, which I don't normally do, which is just throw in a comment in case you want it about that Southeast High School, because I know that came up this morning in question period. And I just wanted to echo what Councillor Keating was saying, which is that ultimately this is a decision for the Catholic School Board. They are an elected body, and I will not step in on their jurisdiction. However, there has been some question about whether it is the city's fault that this high school is being moved, and it isn't. However, if the Catholic School Board feels that part of the problem is the timelines it'll take to get to approval, and I've told them that I'm very happy to look at that and see what the city can do. But the board has assured me that the city has worked with them very, very well on this project, and they're not blaming the city for this.